Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. And today I'm delighted to welcome back Jacob Williams. You're most welcome, sir. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum assalam, Paul. It's great to be here again and good to be on your channel again.
Thank you very much. For those who don't remember, Jacob is an Oxford PhD candidate in political theory. He's published academic work on religion, conservatism, and Western culture. And his commentary has appeared in the American magazine First Things, The Imaginative Conservative, The Critic, and elsewhere. He's also the director of domestic policy at Pickthall House, a UK think tank aimed at improving relations between Muslim communities and the West, alongside addressing other policy challenges. And I will put the link in the description below. Now, you recently published what I think is a fascinating article titled "A War for the Soul of Germany." And this is a review of Paul Carl's book, Multiculturalism and the Nation in Germany, a study in moral conflict. And I'm just going to show everyone what it looks like because it's rather good. Here we go. So this is the article, as you can see, published online. I will obviously share it in the description below as well. It's a very interesting read. I do recommend it. So just to come back to this, having read your article, I want to ask you, what interests you about the internal political conflicts in Germany, and how are Muslims being impacted by this?
Yeah, so I think one of the reasons I'm interested in this is that in some ways Germany is a particular exemplar of wider political conflicts going on across the Western world, obviously because of its particular history. These questions are especially sensitive in Germany. And so I think it's also true the kind of ideological divides are articulated in a particularly sharp way. Mm-hmm. So you have this very, I can go into this more perhaps later on, but you have this very, very, very firm division between this ideal of Germany as a civic nation, where anyone can be German if they just subscribe to a set of liberal values, and the idea of Germany as an ethnocultural nation, where maybe people who are not originally ethnically German can assimilate into it, but that might involve quite radical changes, not just in their political values, but maybe in their religious beliefs, maybe in their wider set of cultural habits, and might take a very long time, which is the kind of basis of a lot of the opposition to the whole set of things you might think of as multicultural policies, and also to the current type of immigration that Germany has experienced.
Yeah. So in Germany, in your article, it's very clear that you seem to be witnessing a clash between civic nationalism, which is more like, say, the American model, where people share common ideas about the nation. So it's a kind of philosophical, ideological commitment over against an emerging ethno-nationalist kind of movement based more on ethnicity and even biology, even race, and some of the more extreme iterations of that, because echoes of Nazi Germany to some extent. And these groups clearly see each other as enemies. It's something you write a lot about in the article, drawing on Durkheim, the sociologist, a great deal. Also, it's a review of a book by this guy Carls, and you write, if I may quote your article, clearly with these respective commitments, the multicultural left and the popularist right cannot but see each other as enemies. The very expression of each side's respective doctrines is an offense against the other's sacred values. And you talk a lot about the sacred values that people hold. Merely asserting, in the case of the more moderate ethno-nationalism of parts of the AfD, that minorities must assimilate into a majority culture is tantamount to a verbal assault on the sacred idea of equal human dignity as upheld in liberal constitutional patriotism. So you have this profound split in the very idea of what it is to be German, or what it is to live in Germany at the moment. And as you rightly say, this is not just in that country. It affects, has similar dynamics in Britain, actually, and France and other countries, Italy, in Europe as well.
Yeah. That's absolutely right. In that particular passage, I'm kind of glossing Carls, because he, of course, uses Durkheim to explain this division. He uses Durkheim's idea of moral facts, where these are not really claims about objective morality. They're just claims about how communities kind of construct a set of moral norms, and then they might regard some of those norms as sacred, and therefore speaking against them is an affront or an offense. I don't necessarily think that Carles is entirely right, that this is the be-all and end-all of how we should analyze moral conflict. But to the extent that these are like real dynamics, that there really are these very deeply held beliefs about the sacred, which are not, at very least, we can all agree, are not easily accessible to rational discourse, which is not to say absolutely impossible, then you do have this enormous difficulty in dialogue, which I think you see in countries like Germany and elsewhere. Mm-hmm. In countries like Britain, which you mentioned, I think we generally don't have as prominent and as explicit a kind of narrowly ethno-nationalist movement, one that would say you can never become British if you're from the wrong ethnicity. That's not a particularly mainstream view, even among the right-wing parties in Britain. But you do have clearly a division as to sort of how much integration or assimilation is desirable or required. And these really do engage people's deepest beliefs about what they hold to be sacred, and therefore are very difficult to, I don't think impossible, but very difficult to deal with in a civil and constructive way.
Well, one of the things, the constant calls for assimilation around in the West and Britain here, obviously, as well. I always get confused by this because I always want to know, assimilate into what exactly? I mean, what is it we've been asked to assimilate into? Are Muslims being asked to go to the pub? Are Muslims being asked to become Christians? Are Muslims being asked? I mean, what is it we've been asked to do exactly? Because it's not as if there's a public space called the other, what we need to assimilate into, which is clear and defined and has a moral code. Which it seems very constantly changing and shifting. We've seen that over the evolution of LGBT and gay marriage. It's not static. And also within the dominant culture, you have conservative Christians, you have conservative Jews, and even conservative atheists, I think, who wouldn't agree with some of these new orthodoxies that we're expected to bow the knee to. So I'm not at all clear. What is it you think people actually want people to assimilate to? Or is it just a case of racism and not liking Muslims, perhaps, really? That's what underpins this kind of claim to, call to assimilation.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very complex, and I think we should kind of look at each case, each movement, each person, each doctrine, sort of as it's articulated, because it really is important that we analyze these things in a granular way and respond to them in the most sophisticated way possible. In general, I think there's maybe three things going on with what you alluded to, and one of them is, so it is of course true that if there was, say, a kind of unified, or at least more unified British culture, even among the ethnic majority, that has in many ways substantially disappeared due to things like secularization and changes in personal values and so on. And also just sort of cultural globalization and the patterns of kind of disintegration that's produced. It's completely true that makes it often very hard to know what could be meant by assimilation. So it seems to me, when people use these kind of terms, there are, as I say, probably three things they have in mind in different cases. And one of them might be the idea of kind of becoming part of what we might call a community of memory. So, maybe there isn't this set of unified religious or personal values, but maybe there's some sense in which you sort of identify with the nation at a deep level. You sort of see it as the first person plural. You're a part of for certain purposes. You identify with its history. And with maybe there's a stock of kind of tacit and implicit norms about how people interact with each other, which is also part of that. And that's one thing I think that people think of. And we could talk more about this if you want. This might tie into debates people are having about things like cousin marriage, or sort of cultural practices that are sometimes said to be problematic. And another thing might just mean, sometimes people just mean integration. So not necessarily coming from explicit ethno-nationalists, but some people, when they say assimilation or integration, what they just mean is, well, we think people should accept a set of common political norms, right? So they should sort of agree that we should have these democratic institutions, the rule of law, maybe ideas of tolerance, which obviously can still be defined in different ways and are often ambiguous, but maybe are not completely ambiguous. Maybe there's a sort of certain set of limits to that. We can go into that more if you want as well. And yeah, the third thing is, yes, sometimes it is just a mask for a kind of visceral hatred of people who appear different, right? And that's also true. And it's often very hard to kind of tell these three things apart, but I think the only way we kind of make progress is by trying to.
I mean, one of those things you spoke of, the need to assimilate so we respect the law of the land, for example. I mean, this is something that ethnic minorities in general certainly do respect, in my experience, and Muslims obviously do as well. They're joined by Islam to follow the law of the land, as long as it doesn't, require them to break, to do things which are contrary to their faith, like eat pork or something, which is not the case. So it's hard to know what Muslims need to do. I'm also struck by the slight double standards here. I know from my experience in France that there are substantial English communities, and in Spain as well, where people happily live there legally, but they rarely speak English or Spanish. And they certainly not very keen on French/Spanish food. They like their fish and chips. They even have their own fish and chip shops, and the Spanish of the Sun apparently exists, and so on and so forth. So, and these are called expats. They're never called immigrants, but of course they are immigrants because they immigrated living into a different country. So there's a slight double standard there in the way that we see ourselves when we are living abroad to when we and when the people from abroad come live amongst the indigenous population of the UK.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's often true. There are certainly, I think, many very valid criticisms people in some of these countries could make about the behaviour of British people abroad. I think that's definitely true. There might be a sense in which I'm not necessarily defending this position, but there might be a sense in which people think, well, there's a set of cultural values that Britain, or most of Britain and most of Germany, kind of have in common, and that maybe most of countries outside of Europe don't, and maybe that's to do with kind of certain ideas of cultural memory or norms of behavior. So I don't think we should just reduce it all down to it's just hatred. But yeah, sometimes there are double standards. Definitely, it's completely valid to point that out. As I say, these things are very, very complex to disentangle.
I mean, it just strikes me, before we go back to Germany for a second, back to the UK here, and perhaps everywhere, that what do most Muslims want? They want, like everyone else, good schools. They want to see law and order. They want to see clean streets. They want to be good neighbours. They want to work and pay their taxes, and they want to be good citizens of the country that they're in. This is absolutely the norm amongst Muslim communities. So I'm often wondering what it is that they're being asked to do more than that, to assimilate. You mentioned this kind of nebulous idea about British history. Well, if they're immigrants, they're not necessarily going to be being part of the English Civil War memory, the memory of the English Civil War, or the clash between Catholics and Protestants, or Victorian England. And not that there is that, I suppose, but is it that important that we relive those memories or have those shared memories to be assimilated in a society? I mean, how important are these things that you allude to?
Yeah, I don't have a firm view on that question. So one way of thinking about it is to say, well, within Islam as well, and indeed, all across the world, on the whole, people value living in these kind of deep cultural communities to at least some extent, and the idea that one can have a legitimate sort of love of your nation and tribe is not alien to Islam either. And so sometimes if people have a preference that their geographical or national community wouldn't undergo radical cultural change, I don't think that's necessarily evil or illegitimate. Of course, it's a very different question once there are large numbers of people who have a different cultural background living in these places, as you rightly point out, the overwhelming majority in goodwill, in a law-abiding and peaceful way, then of course, having that preference may be valid, but then people have to find a way to get on with each other. And that's kind of where these debates about multiculturalism versus integration versus assimilation come into the picture. There's also a sense in which, even if we just focus on integration, which is just political values, so you absolutely, of course, rightly point out that obviously the overwhelming majority of Muslims obey the law, want to obey the law, don't want to cause any problems for the rest of society, and want to contribute. And of course, this is like entirely true. Now, I don't think that necessarily means that we should say that every concern that, say, for example, a Western country might have about, say, political beliefs affirmed by Muslims is necessarily invalid, or just can be reduced to just racism, for instance, right? So it might be the case, and I make this point just to point out that resolving this tension is often harder than we think. It might be the case that some Muslims, many Muslims maybe, absolutely obey the law, absolutely want to just live in peace and get on with people, but have different beliefs about what an ideal political state would look like. So I'm not a theologian, I'm not a scholar, I'm not going to sort of comment on what's the best Islamic view of any of this stuff here. That wouldn't be appropriate for me to do. But clearly, some Muslims would have different views as to what an ideal kind of political society would look like to most Western people, whether they be Christians or just secular liberals or whatever. And it might be a valid concern from the point of view of non-Muslims to think, well, the Muslim community or the section of the Muslim community that has these ideals is completely law-abiding and peaceful, but also what would happen if they had enough power and numbers to kind of change the political regime? Now, that's a question that's really, really complex and difficult to deal with. And the only point I'm making here is that when people ask that sort of question, they're basically asking, is this just a practical compromise for now? What would happen in the future? And that isn't necessarily a concern that we should just write off as racism. I think it's a really complex question about morality and politics, and also about theology. That's it's a big intellectual challenge.
I see what you mean. It's just when we have Muslims in political power in the UK, say Mayor of London or the head of the Scottish National Party, he's no longer Hamza Yusuf, not the one in California, but the one in Scotland. These people didn't seem very Muslim in that they were often supporting very progressive causes, shall we say, and didn't really speak out on many issues until some of them left office. Like Hamza Yusuf now is very pro-Palestinian outside of office, but I don't recall him being quite so outspoken when he was in office. The Mayor of London, for example, is not particularly radical in his utterances. Maybe I missed them. And there are a number of mayors around the country who are Muslim, apparently, and who also are not very radical. I'm just wondering when these people, Muslims, do achieve power, that they don't become the bogeyman of the threat that people perceive at all. On the contrary, they become very assimilated, perhaps too much, according to some people.
Well, yes, this is true, of course. It doesn't necessarily make it false that. And so I think people like Sadiq Khan, Hamza Yusuf, I think it's very clear they are, for better or for worse, I think that they're sincerely committed to the things that they say they believe. That they are, in a certain sense, liberals, and there might be ways in which, probably there are ways in which, they have gone to a degree in kind of endorsing certain progressive causes that isn't necessarily in any way a good thing, but. People who look at these figures and say they're not sincere, they don't really believe this because they're Muslims. That's awful and wrong and false. Now, acknowledging that doesn't necessarily mean that if a person might wonder, well, if there were 3 or 4 times as many conservative Muslims in the country as there are now, what would happen to our overall political life? That's an invalid question to ask. And of course, we know, many conservative Muslims do have different beliefs about an ideal political life. And there's many ways of kind of approaching that. One might be, well, maybe there's just an implicit contract that even if Muslims sort of gained this power overall, I don't mean 1 or 2 mayors, I mean, across the entire nation, there'd be an implicit contract with the other communities that the basic kind of, as it were, minimal kind of liberal norms, aren't going to change. That's one way of thinking about these questions that I know some Muslim scholars have discussed. Another is there are some Muslim scholars who sort of ask questions about what are the political ideals in a more fundamental way. But yeah, I mean, I think we should just try to have open-ended and good faith dialogues with non-Muslims where they're open to it, who raise these kind of questions. And I think doing that can only build understanding and kind of make things better.
Yeah, and I think with that going into the whole Palestine issue, which of course is a very traumatic issue for all of us, as the genocide is going on as we speak. Awful things we're seeing now. Without going into that issue so much, but the Muslims are obviously well known to support the Palestinians in their suffering at the moment, and indeed, as does most of the world. Actually, the global South, United Nations, it's just a small minority, it seems, of Western countries that have a different view. And the reason I mention that is because it seems to me, that was my personal view, that the West, in terms of its governance and states, are absolutely committed to Israel as a geopolitical, philosophical, even commitment, regardless of the government in power, whether it's Labour or Conservative, whatever. Same in other countries like Germany. And so the reason this was relevant to what you're saying is that Muslims, therefore, and indeed not just Muslims, there are others in Britain, for example, who support the Palestinians, find themselves against this kind of hegemonic established power structure that is absolutely committed, it seems to me, to the ongoing existence of Israel as a state and all that it stands for in the Middle East, militarily, politically, philosophically, you name it. And so to integrate, for us, for Muslims and others, to integrate into this hegemonic structure is deeply problematic, because I think most of the world would see it as deeply problematic. It's not a minority thing. Most of the world, as I say, supports the plight of the Palestinians. But I think papers like The Telegraph, I was reading The Telegraph today, some very unfortunate articles, in my opinion, basically demonizing the protesters who support the Palestinians and demonizing Palestinians and Muslims themselves. Again, you get this very regularly in some sections of the media, but it speaks to an established political entrenchment in the West across virtually all countries, perhaps not Spain, perhaps not Ireland, which really puts us as Muslims and as those who oppose that on the back foot. And in some sense, very at dis-ease with what's going on. And it's difficult to see how we can unify and be a culture or a nation in that kind of context. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of completely valid concerns. I think that it's important that we don't kind of reify these things, that we don't imagine that there's a cabal directing the policy of all Western governments from behind the scenes, for example. And we don't imagine that things can't change. Of course, there are people within Britain and other governments who criticize what Israel has been doing in Gaza over the last 2 years. And so I think that we should find allies on these issues where we can, work within the system to kind of bring about change as best we can. And it's very, very easy when you see this horrible suffering to sort of adopt a posture of despair and to think, this is never going to change. The whole West is just one entity that's committed to one thing. But that actually isn't true, and it isn't hopeful. And we should always have hope, and we should always also do everything we can pragmatically to find allies, to work with people in the most effective way possible, and also just understand at a deep level the dynamics of politics. You can look at works by people like John Mearsheimer, who is a very sophisticated political scientist who's analyzed the operations of what is usually called the Israeli lobby in America. And this isn't some secret recipe for controlling an entire government. It just comes down to normal operations of human behavior. It comes down to normal things that anyone can do if they just have the sort of will and resources and skill to do them. So there's always ways in which we can, I think, shift the direction of politics in a way that's more human and more humane, and hopefully, God willing, does something about some of this terrible suffering in Palestine and elsewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I very much hope you're right. And perhaps lastly, I just want to ask you about a question that's often on my mind. I have a conversation with a friend of mine. I won't say who he is. He's much more pessimistic than I am about the future of Muslims in Europe. He sees the end game very much in terms of maybe expulsion of Muslims from Europe, or worse, in terms of attacks on Muslims wholesale. It's a very dark vision of the future. And of course, it's possible. Who knows? God knows. But I still think. Do you not think, nevertheless, without going perhaps to that extreme, that we are historically looking at the massive big picture and saying we are in fact moving in a direction in the West which is becoming more and more difficult for Muslims as a group, that we're not just some kind of temporary difficulty, that this is part of a movement, a trajectory trajectory towards a darker future?
Yeah, I mean, there's of course there's a lot of extremely worrying trends, absolutely, and I think the best way to look at these things is to think, well, what are some things that we can do that would address some of the causes of these trends? Now, one thing you can't do much about is visceral hatred. To the extent that's a factor, you can't really engage with it. There's nothing you can do. A person who just is determined to hate you because of how you pray or the color of your skin, what can we do about that? But that's not the only factor. So I think we can be, promoting Muslim public intellectuals. You want to have these kind of good faith, sophisticated dialogues about, what are the commitments of Islam? What are the commitments of the West? How can we actually articulate a really credible, believable way of how we're going to get on with people in these countries? I think that's really important, and will do a lot of good if we can do more of that.
You do that, by the way. You do that on GB News. You yourself, as a public intellectual, go on GB News regularly. I think I'm amazed that they let you.
I'm flattered you'd say I'm a public intellectual. I've been on there a few times, and it's very interesting because actually a lot of people on there I don't think are personally hateful towards Muslims as such. Many of them sometimes are misinformed about some things. Others might have legitimate concerns that sometimes Muslim voices aren't always doing the best job of answering and addressing. So there's always ways we can kind of engage with these things. And I would also make the point, it might be a little bit of a controversial point to make, but I think it is often true. The pace of migration, not just from Muslims, from all kinds of societies into many countries in Europe over especially the last 10 years, really has been far higher than the vast majority of people in Europe wanted.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's morally wrong, as I said earlier, to care about the kind of cultural character of your community. There are also economic reasons people have these concerns. Yeah. And I think that some of the hostility is actually coming from that. It is coming from this feeling that people have kind of lost control of the future shape of their societies. And if people felt that they had that control and they felt that they have some ability to just make sure that change isn't too quick and is moderated if they want it to be, I think some of the animus, some of the hatred would reduce. And it's not a coincidence that it's increased over the last 10 years.
No, I think you're right. There's a huge increasing pressure on social services and so on in Britain and elsewhere as well. But I do, without changing the whole nature of what we're talking about here, Britain is not an island in the sense of militarily and politically in the world. It very much projects power, and it projects its armies, whether it be Iraq or Afghanistan and other countries. And I mention that, of course, because in creating wars and turmoil in the world, in our globalized society, of course, then people will come. Recently there was the hoo-ha about the Afghans who were here because they had been promised to come here because they collaborated with the British in Afghanistan. But this is because we were there in the first place, invading a country. If we weren't invading that country, would there be any Afghans here? Why would they come here in the first place? So there is a relationship, a dialectic, symbiosis between.
Oh yeah, of course, absolutely.
So we can't sit back and say, "Oh, the immigrants," when we are directly causing the ferment, and the wars which generate mass movements of people around the world. In other words, we're involved in this problem. We're not just victims of this problem, so to speak.
Of course, that's true, and a lot of people do try not to blame the immigrants, but to blame the governments, including actually, and it's interesting. A lot of people these days on the political right, are extremely critical of these wars, not just because they have generated flows of refugees and migrants, but also because they recognize that this kind of enormous hubris in the sort of early 2000s of, well, the West can just sort of use military power to remake societies in its own image was just a terrible, inhumane, and grossly impractical idea. And this is quite widely believed among many people who are critical of current levels of immigration. So there's always sort of room for acknowledging these things and trying to engage in dialogue.
I just want to show, before I forget, that there was a very short clip that was posted on social media yesterday. It features the current interior minister in Austria, and she had some rather striking things to say about Muslims on camera. So I just wanted to share that with you. So this is a post by 5 Pillars, the Muslim news agency, where she says, there's subtitled in English, that the headscarf, the hijab, is a sign of oppression. And so the hijab has to be banned from schools. She's trying to pass a law outlawing headscarves, pretty much like in France, I guess. And it's interesting to see what she says.
Das Kopftuch ist ein Zeichen der Unterdrückung. Bei einer entscheidenden Phase, wo sich die Persönlichkeit entwickelt, wo sich der Körper entwickelt, hinter dem Kopftuch versteckt. Und diese extremistischen Tendenzen, gerade bei Kindern, haben einfach an unseren Schulen nichts verloren.
So just play that.
Das ist ein Zeichen der Unterdrückung. Mädchen werden da in einer ganz entscheidenden Phase, wo sich die Persönlichkeit entwickelt, wo sich der Körper entwickelt, hinter dem Kopftuch versteckt. Und diese extremistischen Tendenzen, gerade bei Kindern, haben einfach an unseren Schulen nichts verloren.
Okay, I mean, well, whether or not you think children in schools should whether you think children in schools should wear hijab or not, I don't really have a view on that. But it's it was the tone of what she was saying, the way she was speaking about it, the language of extremism. She said this is extremist tendency, that hijabs as such oppress women, the oppression. That this is this
right.
frame of the issue. Well, whatever you may feel about kids wearing hijab, whatever, but her framing of it is clearly stigmatizing, I think, and clearly somewhat concerning, I think.
Yeah, I mean that's completely true. I think one of the ways we can try to engage with this particular issue is just to point out actually the idea of modesty, and including covering your hair in some situations, is not alien to Western and Christian cultures either. I always like to point out that the late Queen Elizabeth used to wear something very like a hijab on many occasions. So this is not something that we should just regard as from either side as this like symbol of Muslimness versus the secular West. It's actually very much more complex than that. As you say, the question of children is a different one. And the notion of extremism is really very, very, I think, unhelpful in a whole number of ways. One of which is, so quite apart from sort of concerns about, well, how do we draw the line as to what counts as extreme and what doesn't? I think one concern is that if you're trying to tackle extremism, you're trying to tackle a set of sort of abstract beliefs that may or may not manifest themselves in any actual political behavior. And it's very, very difficult, as we've seen in places like Britain with the PREVENT program, which is supposed to tackle so-called non-violent extremism. It's very, very difficult to actually identify instances of this and then to try to use any kind of policy tool to change people's abstract beliefs in an effective or predictable way that actually goes on to then change their behavior, which is why these programs don't seem to be very good at actually reducing violence and terrorism. So the idea of extremism doesn't really help. I think there are other concepts might be more useful. Obviously, just looking at behaviors would be a good start. Actually looking at when people are trying to either organize violence or in some other way directly undermine a government, and these are completely valid things, and we can just look at those things as and when they come up, rather than trying to say, well, what's the abstract ideology behind it? Is it extremist? Is it not? It doesn't really help us in tackling these issues.
No, I think it's bizarre that, as you say, a symbol of modesty should be connected in any way by a leading political figure with extremism. It's just has nothing whatsoever. And the opposite of extremism, modesty, is not extreme. Modesty is a good thing. It's virtuous. So it's the most bizarre characterization from a leading European politician there. I mean, Britain is quite different in some ways from the rest of mainland continental Europe. And one of the differences that always struck me, and you will know this as a student at Oxford University, I remember when I once went to Oxford, I was invited to pray on a Friday at the prayer room there. And the prayer room that I visited at Oxford was part of the university in the physics department at Oxford University. And when you go to Oxford University, they have the incredible physics department, and there's a big sign outside on the street saying Oxford University Physics Department, and underneath it says Muslim prayer room. So you literally go to the physics department and there's an area set aside for Muslims to pray. Now, a lot of the physics students are Muslims, and the guy who introduced me to it was doing his PhD in physics at Oxford, and he's a Muslim. But this whole thing, which may sound unremarkable to a British audience, I had a friend of mine from Germany, back to Germany again, who is his family are from Turkish origin, but he was born and brought up in Bremen in Germany. And he himself is a scholar, and he studied at Oxford as well. And he said, in Germany, this could never, ever happen. You could never have a prayer room in a university. And ditto in France, and presumably for the whole rest of Europe as well. It would just be inconceivable for the German universities to actually allow people to pray on their premises. A completely different mindset there. So questions of assimilation are very different, I think, in Britain than they are in Germany, where even to become a citizen of Germany, you have to subscribe to various kind of statements of belief, including that you support Israel's right to exist. Israel is mentioned explicitly in the immigration process, and in Holland you have to approve of LGBT, and all these kind of things you have to agree to or affirm. Which I, as a British citizen, would never be required to affirm anything like that. I wouldn't be required to affirm a country in the Middle East. What's that got to do with me? I mean, it's rather bizarre, really, isn't it, that we should have views about the Middle East to become a fully integrated citizen? But that is the case in some places.
Right. No, this is true, of course. And traditionally, British identity was not based on any kind of creed or sort of set of things that citizens were expected to. I mean, we didn't even really have the concept of citizens until 70 or 80 years ago. We were just British subjects of the crown, and then that was a matter of your political status, not your beliefs.
Yeah.
I think it's also a very, very good thing that in Britain and in different ways in the United States and in the sort of wider English-speaking world, there is this tradition of religious accommodation, which benefits Muslims and other people of faith, where religion is first of all in some ways respected in public life as a sort of contributor to civil society, and also people's interests in practicing their religion are where reasonable, where possible, where practical, accommodated, just as we just see in that example of having a Muslim prayer room. I mean, on what reasonable grounds could anyone object to that, except through some kind of sacralization of a highly specific secular republicanism that would be very, very alien to Britain, and would really be un-British and completely unhelpful to anyone. So I mean, as for example, I interviewed a while ago Tariq Madood, who is a theorist of multiculturalism in Britain, and one of the things he's been very vocal about is he thinks it's a very good thing, not as tolerable, but a positively good thing, that Britain has an established Christian church. We have high regard for Christianity as one of the religions of the book. And also it's a good thing for all people of faith in Britain, because it just means that religion has a kind of place in public life and is honored and respected in certain ways. Yeah. I think that there's great differences there. And I think, our approach is much more practical than that taken by much of Europe.
Yes, and my only concern is this will be under threat in the future. But at the moment, certainly, there is this distinctive difference, and I'm glad for it. Which is why I constantly hear of Muslims, so to speak, doing hijra or emigrating from parts of Europe to Britain, go to Birmingham, to London, precisely because they have freedom to practice faith. They come here to the UK. It's interesting, isn't it? From Germany, France. I've heard of people recently doing that, and one can understand that to some extent. Well, I guess that's all I've got to say, really. One could go on talking for hours about this extremely important subject. And as a link to your article, A War for the Soul of Germany, which is a review of a guy's book on multiculturalism and the nation in Germany, a study in moral conflict. Very interesting review, actually. Very grateful that you've taken the time to understand that and inform us of what's going on in Europe. Do you have any final words before we conclude?
No, I think, Paul, that's been excellent. Really thorough, and I hope that all of your viewers have found it beneficial to some extent.
Inshallah. Well, thank you very much, Jacob. Until next time, thank you very much for coming on. Take care. Assalamu alaikum.
Thanks for having me.